Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jay Devine, Associate Dean of the Mariana Brown Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences here at Carnegie Mellon University. And it's my charge and my pleasure to welcome you to the second annual Thomas M. Kerr Lecture, though today a conversation rather than a lecture, on law in American society, and to introduce our distinguished conversants. First, a brief word about the namesake for this annual lecture. One hat that I wear here at Carnegie Mellon is as pre-law advisor. And in partnership with our student pre-law society, we've expanded our program's mission from simply advising students and alumni about law school to engaging the campus and surrounding communities in conversation about salient issues involving the complex interplay of law, justice, politics, human rights, and the economy that ought to be part of our dialogue as engaged and well-informed citizens. The centerpiece of this effort is our sponsorship of an annual lecture under the broad rubric of Law in American Society. And the namesake of this annual event, as well as of our pre-law society, is the late Thomas M. Kerr, Jr., who was a member of the Carnegie Mellon faculty and the university's pre-law advisor for a quarter century, from the late 1960s to the early 1990s. Professor Kerr passed away in 2006, ending a long and distinguished career in service to his country, to the law, including service in the Justice Department, to his university, and to this region, but leaving behind a strong and enduring legacy. I think you'll find more about him, a more detailed profile of the late Professor Kerr in your program. Our pre-law program is quite proud of our expanded mission, but to command the kind of gravitas that would enable us to attract a speaker of the type of stature of the guest who we welcome today, we needed to partner with a more nationally visible and weightier entity and persona. Fortunately, we had both in the form of our Center for International Relations and Politics, with which we are co-sponsoring today's event, and its director, our own Kyron Skinner. The center, or CERP as we call it, is a research center housed in our Department of Social and Decision Sciences that addresses policy issues through social scientific and interdisciplinary lenses. Its research activities are organized around these major concerns: globalization, which is defined as the intersection of international politics, culture, markets, and technology; grand strategy, defined as the combination of diplomatic, economic, military, and political factors used by leaders to defend their respective nation-states; the role of globalization and grand strategy, among other factors, on state policy, non-state actors, and transnational forces in countries and regions throughout the world; sponsorship, encouragement, and facilitation of research across and at the edge of disciplines which have implications for domestic politics and international relations; and fifth, training of Carnegie Mellon undergraduates and graduate students in analytical social science and the application of scholarly analysis to issues in international relations and politics more generally. The center's founder and director, who joins us here on stage as lead conversant with our guest, is Dr. Kyron Skinner. Dr. Skinner is Associate Professor of International Relations and Politics here at Carnegie Mellon, as well as the W. Glenn Campbell Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Dr. Skinner is widely known in academic circles for her expertise in the areas of international relations, U.S. foreign policy, and political strategy. In 2010, she was appointed to the advisory board of the George W. Bush Oral History Project, and she co-authored Reagan in His Own Hand in 2001, Reagan, A Life in Letters, 2003, and Strategy of Campaigning, Lessons from Ronald Reagan and Boris Yeltsin in 2007. And she's the editor of Turning Points in Ending the Cold War in 2008. Her opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Review Online, and CNN.com. But if one were to say nothing about Dr. Skinner and simply gauge her measure by virtue of those who respond favorably to her invitations, you'd get at least as good a sense of the attention and respect that she and her work command in very elite circles. This is certainly true when considering today's guest and this year's Thomas M. Kerr conversant. Robert B. Zoellick became the 11th president of the World Bank Group on July 1st, 2007. Prior to joining the bank, Mr. Zoellick was vice chairman international of the Goldman Sachs Group. He served in President Bush's cabinet as the 13th U.S. Trade Representative from 2001 to 2005 and as Deputy Secretary of State from 2005 to 2006. From 1985 to 1993, Mr. Zoellick served at the Departments of Treasury and State and briefly in the White House. He earned a J.D. magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, an MPP from the Kennedy School of Government, and a Bachelor of Arts degree with honors and with election to Phi Beta Kappa from Swarthmore College. Mr. Zoellick joins us today to discuss global economic issues, again in the form of a conversation with Dr. Skinner, as well as with audience members who wish to join in. So I thank you again all for gathering here with us today, and I ask you to join me in thanking Dr. Skinner for bringing us our special guest today and in welcoming to the Carnegie Mellon community Mr. Robert Zoellick.
So this is a conversation. There's no particular format beyond, at least I'll start with a question or two, and then we open it up for the audience to ask questions, and that's how you wanted it, and I think that's a great idea. First of all, I'd like to, before I forget, thank all of the young people who are running the center that I'm part of. I don't want to mention names because I will forget a few, but also recognize John Lahosky, the Dean of the Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences, for putting up with our numerous requests, most of which are financial, and Mark Camlett, the provost, as well. I'm looking at you, among many, many others, and thank Jay Devine. And then finally, I'd like to thank the History Department and its head, Carolyn Acker. There was an event scheduled today. Professor Edmund Russell, who was to speak on his work on science and history, and the department graciously rescheduled the talk, of which I all hope you will attend. It will be Monday, February 13th, 4:30, Porter Hall 100. Rescheduled the talk so that many of our scholars could attend this talk today. And I thought it was quite interesting that it would be the history department to do this because Mr. Zoellick was a history major at Swarthmore, and in a recent speech at George Washington, he starts by talking about a book, Thinking in Time, by two historians, Richard Neustadt and Ernest May, and how their study of history has influenced his work at the bank. So my first question is a softball question. Tell us what the World Bank is about.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kyron. And let me thank all of you for coming. I'm very flattered to have such an audience. When Kyron asked me to come to Carnegie Mellon, I was very interested in the invitation, both because I have great respect for her work, and I think the contributions she's made to some of the issues in the end of the Cold War period are only just beginning, but also because I certainly know the quality of this university. It's a wonderful opportunity. And since we touched on history, which I told Kyron was my true love, but I couldn't figure out how to make a living at it, so I started some other things. To start with the World Bank, I might actually make a reference to Professor Kerr, because I saw in his bio, as some of you might have seen, the incredible story on how he enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor and served in the U.S. Marine Corps in some incredible campaigns in the Pacific. And I think, if I recall, won 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. So must have been an extraordinary individual before he started his legal and academic career. And perhaps when I think about the World Bank in relation to some economists, I approach it a little differently, in part because of the historical background. Because when Professor Kerr was fighting in the Pacific, this was the exact time in which the World Bank was being created. It was part of the Bretton Woods institutions created in 1944. And I think it's important to understand the logic of its creation. This was a group of allied powers, even as the war was raging. They were trying to think back on the causes of the Great Depression and what flowed from it in terms of political and security upheaval and the rise of fascism, and trying to recognize how to avoid those problems how to learn from the failures of the peace of 1919, and at the same time deal with what they thought would be the challenging economic issues in the post-war period. So as some of you may know, there really were three institutions created out of this. The IMF, International Monetary Fund, which at that time dealt with the world of creating fixed exchange rates and trying to deal with what are the monetary issues and the basic sort of the fiscal issues of the international order. There was a second organization called the International Trade Organization, which actually was not, the treaty was not ratified by the U.S. Senate. So the whole trading system after World War II was actually built out of a substitute called the General Agreement for Tariffs and Trade, which then led to, in one of the negotiating rounds, the creation of something that is now the World Trade Organization. So this was to deal with the protectionism that came to such force in the 30s. And then the World Bank, which at that time, the cornerstone institution created in 1944, was actually called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So the idea was to reconstruct war-torn countries, and development was actually a rather sort of newer idea at the time. Remember, this was before much of the area of decolonization. And so the first loan of the IBRD was actually to France. And today, when I go to Japan, there's actually a large recognition of the bank's role in creating the bullet trains and some of the reconstruction in Japan. Now, the Marshall Plan, which probably everybody at least has heard of, quickly superseded the bank's role in terms of the reconstruction of Western Europe. And then it moved to the development field, and over the past 60 years, it's gone through the phases of different thinking of development. The reason I start with that is, to me, while I see the developmental components of what is today the World Bank, I see it in the larger context of a multilateral system that is the thinnest of tissues trying to connect sovereign states for the mutual interest. And while the issues change, if you think about it, and of course vast differences in the world of today versus 44 or 45, but issues of international monetary policy and exchange rates, issues of trade, issues of development, issues of investment, those are very current issues. So the question, and this has characterized much of my tenure, is how do you modernize multilateral institutions to meet different challenges? And as probably all of you know, public institutions are sometimes a little sluggish and slow to change, and so, and they build in various interests. Now, what I now am the president of is actually something called the World Bank Group, because since 1944, in addition to that IBRD, there was something created in the 50s during the Eisenhower administration called IFC, International Finance Corporation. So we invest in private companies in the developing world, everything from equity to bonds to various types of guarantees. Then there's something called IDA, the International Development Association, that was created in the 1960s. And this is for the 79 poorest countries. The numbers varied over the years. And for these countries, they get either grants or very long-term loans without interest. And so that funding for IDA has to be replenished every 3 years, partly through reflows and partly through contributions. And there's a fourth element called MIGA, which is Multilateral International Guarantee Association, investment guarantee. That was created in the late 80s to help create investment insurance for dealing with various types of political risk. There's actually a fifth part, too, called ICSID, which is it's a group that deals with the arbitration and settlement of international disputes that countries belong to by treaty. Now, the World Bank ranges all across the world. We're dealing with rising powers, we're dealing with broken states, we're dealing with climate change. But I guess if I would summarize, one of the things is I try to describe what the World Bank Group does. And I say we often start in the whole in explaining this because we're called bank. And most people think what banks are about is lending money, at least until recently. But in reality, when the World Bank Group is at its most effective, money is only one component. And probably what are equally important component partners to it is first being a knowledge and information and experience bank. And this is particularly important now in recent years because of the rise of emerging markets, the incredible amount of knowledge that comes from other developing countries. How do we share that knowledge and experience across the globe with our client countries or with companies? Secondly, we do have financing, and that distinguishes us from a pure research institution. But third, compared to the size of international capital markets, we're still a drop in the bucket. So since the financial crisis hit its full force in the middle of 2008, we've done about $210 billion worth of commitments, which is not small amounts of money, but given the trillions involved in the international economy is quite modest. So when we make investments, we also try to look for ways that we can have influence beyond the individual project or investment. In effect, we're trying to create markets, we're trying to create institutions, we're trying to create capacity. So it may be local currency bond markets, so countries will be able to fund themselves in their own currency. It may be microfinance. It may be carbon finance. It may be the capacity and institutions of an Afghan government to manage its own budget. So when you think about the World Bank Group, I think it's important. Sometimes people have seen it only in the pure economic terms. I see it in the political economy context, and I see part of the challenge is to keep upgrading with the changes in the international economy.
Okay, I just thought of, before we go on, a couple of other people I'd like to thank. John Miller, the head of Social and Decision Sciences, my department, for allowing the center that I'm running to infiltrate the department on a daily basis, and our guests from the various local high schools and from St. Vincent College. So I think I have captured many people.
We'll have time if you missed it.
Yeah. So the next question, and I think if people would like to ask questions, if you line up and along the hallway, in the aisle, we have mics on either side. Also, we have a few more seats down front if a few of you would like to come forward and take a seat. So don't feel shy. So this is not so much a softball question, but in a way it is. In reading what you've been doing during your tenure at the bank, I was struck by the fact that you're right, money is just one part of what you do. You've emphasized for the developing world trying to bring women and girls to greater capacity because there's so much of the global economy. You're doing work on climate change. How has that been, why is that significant to the World Bank's portfolio? Wouldn't it be better somewhere else like the UN or other international institutions? So how do you integrate that with your mandate?
Well, let's take the two. We've each year, the World Bank, as part of our research role, does a major research piece called the World Development Report. And our most recent one is on gender equality and development. And if I could encapsulate in one sentence what our message is, it's that gender equality is smart economics. So I may believe, and perhaps you believe, gender equality is the fair and right thing to do, but what is now extremely demonstrable with the evidence is it's also smart for economies. And indeed, at a time that you read about events in Europe or the United States and people trying to figure out how to expand growth, one of what growth economists will tell you is that it's based obviously on population but productivity. There are huge gains for all economies, developed and developing economies, not necessarily through spending, but just the structure of how women are engaged in economy. And in developing economies, this can be double-digit productivity growth. And it may be based on something as basic as something we did in Ethiopia, where with the land titling system, we worked with the government to ensure that there were 2 lines on land titling for 2 names, not just one. So all of a sudden, there was a huge expansion of women land ownership in Ethiopia, and that became the opening to start to get credit and get inputs for agriculture. And as some of you may know, over half the agriculture workers in sub-Saharan Africa are women. There's example after example of how the involvement of women can increase productivity and growth. And indeed, as I was saying with some of your students, when one Bloomberg reporter saw some of this research, I thought she captured it best by saying, this is the next emerging market in terms of possibilities. So For the bank to think about sharing research and knowledge and information, this is obviously part of a productivity and growth strategy. Now, there's other aspects of this research. So, for example, some of you that follow development may know that Mexico started something called an Oportunidades program, and later some of you may have seen it in Brazil as Bolsa Familia. It's called a conditional cash transfer program. And basically it focuses on cash to the poorest elements, about 15-20% of people in the society, but it's conditioned. People have to send their children to school, and they have to get health checkups. It's probably done more for women's health than anything in the history of Mexico. As an example of how the bank works, this is not something we invented, something that was invented in Mexico, and we helped develop it in Brazil. We now have expanded this program to about 40 different countries in one form or another. And what's intriguing about it is it's done for about 0.5% of GDP. So when you hear about the debate about entitlement programs in the United States, that's a pretty cost-effective program for 15 or 20% of the bottom part of the population, helping them deal with the resilience. But what was striking about it is that the Mexican program gives the money to the woman head of household. And we now have the data coming out of the Brazilian program and others that the use of the money for the children, for the community, sort of in general, the social multiplier effect is much higher if the money is given to the woman head of household. So there's a whole series of aspects. And this is, I was in Davos about a week or two ago, and we were working with a number of private sector partners about credit expansion. So there's a huge opportunity for women's entrepreneurialism, but they often find it harder to get credit access. Some of this can be legal, some of this can be cultural, but it's an example of how the bank can share knowledge, do research, work with countries on programs, and make lives better for people. Now, you asked about climate change. And that's an interesting example of how the bank operates, because partly I've tried to see the bank as a player within networks. In a way, whether it's private capital markets and private equity markets or others, we're trying to figure out how we can, in a sense, crowd in other players. Now, in the field of climate change, you're exactly right, Kyron. There's the negotiations for climate change occur under something called the UNFCCC. And they're the ones that sort of put together the various negotiating frameworks. But as an example of how the world has changed, even from when I started as USTR in 2001, you'll never, ever deal with a climate change issue unless you engage emerging markets and developing countries. So, look at the carbon production of China or India or others. In addition, a lot of these countries are the ones that are affected by it, starting with small island states that could get flooded, but also many coastal states. So the role of the bank is to try to connect the issue of development and growth with the climate change agenda. And in some ways, we've been more successful than the great negotiations because this also gives people insights a little bit how governments work. Those are often done by environment ministries or foreign affairs ministries. And they're obviously trying to debate the notion of sharing burdens and responsibilities, in this case of carbon, for 195 countries. That's an extremely difficult task. I was involved with the Rio Agreement in '92 under Bush 41, so I have some feel for this. We're actually trying to work with developing countries to see how we can help them with their energy efficiency. There's huge gains in energy efficiency, which reduces carbon, cuts costs. We're working on experimentation with some of the avoided deforestation. One of the things that I worked with Secretary Paulson, former Secretary of Treasury, to do is we created something called climate investment funds. And this is an interesting example. We got contributions of about $6 billion from developed countries for these climate investment funds. We've leveraged them through other bank resources, private sector, other sources, to about $50 billion. And we've done projects in about 45 developing countries that range from technology to energy efficiency to forestation. Now, this is an on-the-ground example of how to actually make the issues work. And so every time we work with a country, we're building support for the agenda as well as trying to learn what works and what doesn't work. And it's an interesting sort of model of how the international system works, because some of you may have heard about the UN Green Fund. Okay? Well, if a UN Green Fund is up and running at some point, these climate investment funds will probably be part of a portfolio, part of a fund of funds. But my logic is while people are debating the Green Fund, we've got something up and running. And as we do it, we build more support. So again, my life has combined a little bit of diplomacy and politics and economics and an executive role. One interesting example of this is India is often a very tough negotiator on climate change. But I had the prior Indian environment minister want to do a project with our climate investment funds to show India's support for them. So it's an example of where the bank sometimes can do things on the ground, make real things happen. I mean, I mentioned avoided deforestation. It's an interesting example. About 5 years ago, people realized that, by stopping people from cutting trees in many of these areas, that the estimate was that was about 17% of greenhouse gases. So that's the concept. If you go back and you look at the Kyoto Treaty, you don't get credit for not cutting down trees. So you had to take the concept and put it into sort of legal language. But the real issue was, that's a nice concept. How do you make it work on the ground? How do you make sure that if you don't cut down trees here, that you're not cutting down trees somewhere else? What do you do with the indigenous people that live in the forests? How do you make avoided deforestation in a green fund work, where you create economic incentive payments? And that's what we do. So we go through all the hassle of trying to learn how to make that work. And just to give you an idea of, again, where the practical aspect of this, one other notion I've been trying to push is it appears that, again, estimates are that soil carbon done properly could absorb about 13% of greenhouse gases. Soil carbon is in a way where avoided deforestation was 10 or 15 years ago. That's the concept, but how do you measure it? How do you implement it? How could you connect this with African agriculture? So to think about the bank, this really goes back to your opening question, it's a mistake to think about it simply as a rate of return on individual loans. It's how do we interconnect some of these disciplines and add value?
Okay. We have a number of questions, and if you want to stand up in the aisles, one of our people will give you a microphone.
Sure. Maybe if you could give your name and where you're from.
Sure. My name is Otto Chu, and I'm chairman of Chu Financial Management Corporation, a local investment management firm. If the World Bank were being formed from scratch today, its ownership shares and participation might look quite a bit different than it did. Obviously, it's a function of its historical antecedents, as you point out. I'm wondering, given the pressures from some of the BRIC nations and some of the other developing nations, some of whom are net creditor nations now and have GNPs that are sizable, what steps might the World Bank take and its sister organization, the IMF, to further engage the Chinas and Brazils and developing countries that have potentially a big role to play in helping to provide funding for the rest of the world?
This is a very big and important issue, so be patient with me a little bit, but I'm partly in the spirit of history trying to talk about these a little bit as an international relations as well as an economic issue. When I came to the bank in 2007, one of the views that was current was the bank shouldn't work with middle-income countries. In other words, why not focus just on these 79 poorest? The mindset that I brought, you can see, of modernizing multilateralism would be this would be a huge strategic mistake, because part of the challenge in the international order will be how can we both work with those countries but also get them to share their responsibilities. So we just talked about climate change. You're never going to deal with climate change unless you figure out a way to engage some of those emerging markets. And increasingly what we're going to see is whether trade or investment patterns, it's not only China's development, but it's going to be China's investment in other areas. So how do we build this multilateralism designed for one era and shift it? Second point, the way this is what you described is often called the voice and representation issue at the institution. And what it reflects, and just to share with people, where the bank is different than, say, the UN, where every country has sort of one vote, is that we have a voting based on shares. And so the United States, for example, has about 16% of the shares, so it has 16% of the votes. And this was based on the logic in a way of saying, well, gee, the League of Nations didn't work so well because everybody had one vote, but there's some countries that are more influential. So it was based on the idea of being more corporate in a way. If you got a bigger economic interest, you have more shares. Now, as you probably pointed out, the world has changed in terms of its economic size and location. So one of the issues that I've had to deal with in my tenure was, what can we do to increase the shareholding of developing countries? And we've actually moved up their shares to about 47%. But and this is an important issue, but it can be an overstated issue. And let me explain why. Sometimes, we rarely vote as an institution. So one of the other things that we did is we have a 24 members on our board, countries that either represent individual countries or groups of countries. What was probably more important than the share change, we added another chair for sub-Saharan Africa because there were really only 2 chairs. So actually adding another voice at the table was probably more important than the maneuvering of the shares. The second issue that I've sometimes probed people on is to say, there's this concept of, well, let's have 50-50 between developing and developed. And so one of the questions I ask people is, well, when does a country move from developing to developed? What's Singapore? And if you're going to have a goal 50-50, and if our goal is to get all developing countries to be developed, does that mean that someday that Zimbabwe has 50% of the shares? So what's the real logic here? And the reason I press these questions is not because I'm against the share shift. I actually made that happen, at least to a certain degree. But I'm trying to move a little bit out of the old north-south logic here. I'm trying to get a sense that the way in which development is working and the economy is working is a far more complex network. Now, however, the way that I have tried to approach the voice and representation issue beyond the shares is how we treat countries. So frankly, as I've touched on, in a way, the old logic was prescriptions that come from an elite institution of well-trained economists from certain universities that tell developing countries what to do. If that ever worked, which I doubt that it did, it's not going to work today. So what does that mean? One of the aspects is when we work with our client countries, we try to understand this as problem solving. And so sometimes the best economic textbook solution, if it doesn't match the political economy, doesn't work. On the other hand, we share the experience of what's happened in other countries, now increasingly developing countries. So yes, it has to be owned by the local people, but you can bring the experience of other countries. Another part is the population of the staff of the bank. So I've worked very hard now, about half the officers are from developing countries, half the officers are women, trying to really change the composition and the nature. Now that actually makes for a very interesting institution to run. I could see that Carnegie Mellon also, one of the things that has probably transformed this institution over 20, 30 years, or at least back when I was in school, was the fact that you now have a much more international sort of student body and probably faculty as well. And that actually can make a stronger institution because you get different perspectives, you get different skill sets, but it does also lead to a certain executive challenge. So these are kind of other issues going forward. So I think the other point, I guess, that is avoiding a little one-size-fits-all, this issue also relates to the IMF, as you mentioned. When we think of the shares for the bank, one may want to use a slightly different formula than the IMF, in that the IMF is based on some aspects of size and economy and trade and others. Remember, the World Bank still does have to raise some money, like for the IDA. So some of the Nordic countries, for example, will say, well, look, we contribute a lot to this. Shouldn't that be shown up in some degree of our shares? And I think that's a reasonable point as well.
We'll take some more questions. Maybe we'll take a couple of them in groups. Is that good?
Hello, my name is Simon Curtis, and I'm the head of the American Middle East Institute. And I just had a question about the Arab Spring and Egypt and Libya in particular. I mean, some of these countries are destitute now because of the turmoil. And I was just wondering if you could comment on, is there a change in direction as far as the World Bank is concerned with some of these countries that are having such an upheaval?
And you want to take a couple more? Or do you
How about two? Because it's hard for me to remember too much, but okay, go, let's do two at a time.
One more and then we'll...
James Burnham. I'm a former U.S. Executive Director of the bank, and I want to A couple years ago.
When were you executive director?
In the early 80s, IDA negotiation times. A couple years ago, I was in Turkey, and I was fascinated when the Minister of Economy very proudly announced that Turkey had moved up in some of the World Bank doing business ratings. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that program, because I think it is probably the most effective program the World Bank has ever had, in the sense of the way it puts peer group pressure on developing countries to look at what others are doing and why they're doing it well. And I'd also mention that whenever I show these rankings to students and they see that the countries in which are least friendly to business are also the poorest countries, it makes a huge impact.
Okay, let me start with the Arab world. Very timely, I was just, where'd you go? I was actually just in Israel and the Palestinian territories last week. The first observation, when I came to the bank in 2007, I tried to launch some strategic themes. It's my view of strategy. It's often not, as a historian would know, sort of the great detail, but you need to have some directions that are trying to seize on opportunities as they create. And one of them I launched was the Arab World Initiative. Not that I could foresee the Arab Spring, but I think one could see with the youth bulge and some of the challenges that Arab world had fallen behind, and how could one offer some special support for it. Second, the reality is this is going to be a long process. And as I mentioned, countries have to own their own development process. Outsiders can offer ideas and money and support, but eventually it has to be done by those at home. Third, I'm trying to remember that obviously each country is in special circumstances. So let me take one you didn't mention. Tunisia is obviously much smaller. But when I look back again at the East Asian development experience, I always think it's important not to underestimate the roles that models create for government leaders. Scholars can do the research, do the papers, but often government leaders kind of look to see what works. And if you think about this in the history of East Asia with Japan and Taiwan and Korea and South Korea and then China and Vietnam and others. So therefore, I think Tunisia at this point, Tunisia and Morocco, are the most advanced at being able to move forward both the political change and some of the economic change. But it's not a sure thing by any means. And the interim government in Tunisia worked with us not only on some more inclusive growth, but one of the other themes that we're trying to develop, which is how can we improve the governance and the social accountability by having more transparency. This not only improves the fight against corruption, which was one of the underlying factors, but it also helps draw in the local community, because particularly with various sort of mobile phones and others now, you can start to have people play a role in what's actually happening with the development program in their community. But it requires sort of transforming the openness of these societies. And Tunisia actually put a lot of sort of new laws in place and starting to execute this. And the reason I emphasize Tunisia is that it's going to have its own financial challenges this year. But if we can help make Tunisia and Morocco work, I think for the long term, this is going to be important elsewhere in the region. You mentioned Libya. Libya obviously has a lot of oil. And in that sense, it's a good example of one of the other challenges of development, including many sub-Saharan African countries. It's not so much a question of money, it's a question of governance. It's a question of how they use those resources, whether they're stolen, whether they are shared more broadly with the public. At this point, what we're doing with Libya is just having the first contacts, because it's still a relatively insecure environment, but we're trying to help create the public financial management systems. So again, it's more of a knowledge and expertise, because frankly, none of that exists. And that's going to have to be created to be able to use the funds effectively. Now, you also mentioned Egypt, and Egypt obviously is very big in the Arab world. It has an important role. I think what you read in the newspapers, you're seeing a process that is still very much in train, because you had people in the streets that were calling for a different system. You had a removal of Mubarak, but you still have the military that were part of the old regime, and now you have the question of how the Muslim Brotherhood, which were the major winners in the election, will govern in their relationship. And all this occurs with a country that has a strong sense of pride and nationalism and sensitive about foreign interference. We have continued to have some investment projects in Egypt, but in past months they pulled back because they didn't want to have the idea of creating debt. As you've probably read in the newspapers, their reserves are running low, so now they're reaching out to the IMF, they're reaching out to us to try to see about financial support. But if we do provide additional financial support to the government in general, we will want to do so in the same way I talked about with Tunisia. In other words, trying to make sure it's transparent, that it relates to some of the changes that people were calling for, a broader social accountability. And there'll be tensions with that. But if anything goes back to your question about what's changed, Egypt was growing relatively well prior to the revolution or coup, depending on your point of view. And yet the problem was it didn't really spread to enough people, or it wasn't deep enough, and frankly there was a concern about corruption, and some of this was not only the privileged position of the president's family, but also, frankly, the military, which owns some of the economic point. So I think the reality is this offers an opportunity that I'd like to be optimistic about over time. By nature, I'm an optimistic person, but I'm a realist to recognize this is going to have its twists and turns. It will ultimately also be important, and this relates to the other question, to create an environment for private business investment. That's what's going to create jobs, that's going to create competition. If you look at the East Asian model, frankly, a lot of investment also brought the idea of technology for that level of sort of labor cost. And that right now, when you have political upheaval, that obviously makes it harder, and you can see this in the tourism industry as well. On the idea of the Doing Business report, I agree with you. I think it's been very important as an innovation. It has created an environment where countries, and for those of you that don't know what this is, we look at about 10 different indicators comparatively of everything from starting a business, hiring people, closing a business, taxes. And not surprisingly, the report is a little bit of a challenge for me because countries that rank high like it, countries that don't rank high don't like it. And so I get a lot of static about this in the course of our board. And as in any report, there's always strengths and weaknesses. So some of the research we're doing now is it's important not only to look what's on the books, but how those rules are applied. But I think just to give you a sense, as you properly point out, about how this can create incentives, many of you have probably been reading about what's going on with Russia and sort of some of the middle class coming to the streets and saying, the security and stability that President Putin provided, now Prime Minister Putin, isn't enough, and they want to move the reform movement. It was striking that last week, Prime Minister Putin pledged that he wanted to move Russia from 120th to 20th on the Doing Business report. Now, whether he'll do that's another question, but it goes to your point. The fact that that is on his radar screen, that the fact is he is using that as a metric about how you can create an environment for doing business is a telling lesson. And it also shows the point that I tried to make, that what the World Bank does is much more than put money out. The fact that is simply a knowledge service. That's simply sharing the experience about what works to try to create an environment for private business.
Hi, my name is Keely McCaskey. I'm a student at the University of Pittsburgh. And just to return to your point...
I'm glad they're open-minded here. By the way, I need to know, because I have a friend, is Mark Nordenberg still the chancellor? Okay, I should have seen him. He's the older brother of a friend of mine. So if anybody knows him, please say hello.
Okay. Yeah, so to return to your point about climate change and particularly avoiding deforestation, I have a concern about your reducing emissions from degradation and deforestation policies, your RED policies, because I think there's a problem when focusing on just carbon as a quantified concept. For instance, when looking at avoiding deforestation and encouraging privatization, I think in a lot of ways that encourages land grabs from indigenous peoples and encouraging monoplantations because perhaps they capture more carbon than old-growth forests. So I was wondering your perspective on sort of why why you wouldn't encourage more regulation and cutting emissions from more of the polluters, the industrialized nations, rather than putting more burden on developing nations. I was wondering how you usually respond to that point.
Okay.
Take one more. Okay.
My name is Apia Adumakon from High School. Most developing countries, especially those in sub-Saharan Africa, are agrarian economy. And back in the 80s, the World Bank asked government to stop subsidizing farmers. And so this has made farm exports from African countries to developed world as very, very expensive. And in Ghana, where I come from, cotton farmers have not been getting value for their sweat. And if you see what happens in developed nations, especially US and Europe, government after government keep on subsidizing farmers in this country. Can you explain to us why the major stakeholders of the bank are subsidizing farmers in their country, but when it goes to developing countries, the bank is preaching a different sermon? And my other question is, we know that the bank is a political institution, but then when we look at what goes on in some African countries, you realize that the bank country director will rate a particular government A+, and as soon as the government leaves office, just a week after the government has left office, the bank country director and the report will start downgrading the regime to F-. And when this thing happens, people will start losing trust in the objectivity that the bank has with the people. Thank you very much.
So let me turn to the red issue first. In 1992, when there was a debate on the Rio Agreement about dealing with climate change, the US and Europe actually had a big debate about sources and sinks. And at that time, there was a view among some that says, look, we shouldn't give credit for sinks, for absorption. We should only sort of regulate the sources. I don't know your view of how effectively we're dealing with climate change now, but in my view, we better use both in terms of trying to create incentives or disincentives for carbon production, but also sinks. And there's a similar view on trading, because I know some people felt, trading is some way illegitimate. We should force the producers of the carbon to stop it. Here I'm applying notions of economic efficiency. So if I can create an incentive system through carbon trading so that somebody can pay somebody to reduce the carbon elsewhere, and it's a net benefit, that's a good thing if you're trying to reduce carbon. And all I would just suggest to you is that if you try to deal with the world of carbon production in a command and control regulatory way, I don't think you're going to be successful. I know you're not going to be successful among developing countries that I work with that think that they're way behind the developed world. And frankly, I don't think you're going to be successful in the United States or even Europe. So if you are serious about trying to deal with the carbon and climate issue, and there's a big debate about the effects and sort of the long term and the modeling and so on and so forth, and I've been dealing with this in one form or another for 20 years. But I think it's a serious enough issue that I think we should encourage sinks, dealing with sinks and absorption, as well as dealing with sources. Now, let's take to the specific aspects of the sinks, the forestation. I suggest you check what we're really doing. I'm not saying you have to privatize areas for forestation. And frankly, we in many parts of the world have done public projects for reforest areas that have had huge benefits in terms of soil, in terms of creating work, in some cases it might be public or private, sort of the area if they do create sort of lumber aspects. I'm very sensitive to old growth forests from other things. The bank works on biodiversity. I've done a whole bunch of biodiversity types of projects. And frankly, we're even trying to see how areas like RED can be connected with wildlife preservation. So we're working with the World Wildlife Fund on something called a wildlife premium. So you can pay more to people if, in addition to preserving the forest, they preserve the wildlife, which is going to be very important. So I honestly think you got to disentangle the aspects of what you said. There are aspects of dealing with forestation and indigenous people, which you're exactly right. And we've spent a lot of time trying to deal with indigenous communities to try to help deal with that issue. And remember, at the end of the day, it's the decision of the countries themselves. So for example, Indonesia, which could be a great force. But I do think that we can bring to bear, because frankly we're subject to an awful lot of international scrutiny about this, appropriate safeguards where we can help avoided deforestation, and whether it's done public or whether there's forestation that's done on a private side, that can be help with livelihoods, help with local communities, and also help deal with the carbon issue. I'm not saying this is your view, but there's a similar question that sometimes comes in with hydropower, where people don't like dams. You know, and because I see this from a development perspective, I just want to share with you, 30% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa have electricity. If you're ever going to want them to help on the carbon issue, you're going to have to help with the electricity issue. And so, because they think they have some right to energy. I mean, try to live your life with 30% of the days having electricity and 70% of the days not having electricity. But I believe we've learned a lot about how you can do hydropower in a way that takes care of the communities and deal with the location issues and some of the environmental issues. So my main point, the reason I'm arguing back at you, is not, I mean, I welcome if there's things we do wrong, we should have the debate. We're an open place to do that. But if you're really concerned about these environmental issues, try to look at how market incentives can work, because I honestly think that's the only way you're really going to be able to address them, and I care about them too. In terms of the issue about the African context, we don't grade countries. I don't know where you come up with the A+ and F-. That's not what we do. Now, we do reports on countries' policies, and we try to help them. We try to help the public. And there's an informed debate. Now, one of the things that I've actually also tried to do at the World Bank is what I call democratize development. So we've opened up data sources. We're helping expand data sources. We have now you check our website. You can find 7,000 data source sets that go back decades and decades, and we're trying to make them much more easily accessible. And we're trying to work with Google, so you can come up, you say you're from Ghana, you can pull up Ghana on our website, and you can see every project we're doing. You can see what the performance is. And what I'm building towards is the ability for local people in those communities to also be able to comment and say, well, this is what's really happening in the project. So again, part of modernizing multilateral institutions is making them open, making them more transparent, making open data sources. But if your point is that we shouldn't be part of a debate about countries' policies, I think that's a mistake. Look at the United States. There's a healthy debate about policies. Look at Europe, I think, and look at Ghana. That's a good thing for it to be. Now, you also asked about agricultural subsidies. Frankly, I'm on your side. I think the U.S. agricultural subsidies program has been a waste of money. I tried to negotiate it away to open markets when I was a trade representative. I'm not against some ideas of crop insurance and some other points. But so I don't take the view that it should only be for developed countries and not developing countries. And that's actually, again, when you say the World Bank is against subsidies, we're not against subsidies, but we are for recognizing what subsidies cost, what the alternative uses are, who gets the benefit. And frankly, if there's any lesson from the U.S. agricultural program subsidies and the Common Agricultural Program is be careful about these becoming a black hole for absorbing a large amount of money. So you mentioned the cotton program in Ghana, and I'm not familiar with the particulars of that, but I know that in a number of the West African countries, part of the challenge of cotton has been you've actually had marketing boards that have actually not been so good to the farmers, but they've been the benefit for some of the governments for some of their own revenue system. And just as an example of that, look to the north. I mean, the Canadians finally did away with the Canadian Wheat Board, and you'll probably see the wheat farmers in Western Canada benefit from it. So I'm sympathetic with you on subsidies from the developed world, but I think, look, part of good analysis, this is Carnegie Mellon, this is a place that's supposed to be a home of analytical quality work, is that please know what you're getting for the subsidy.
Thank you, Mr. President, for coming to Carnegie Mellon. I'm Danny Chen from Heinz College, studying public policy here. As I come from China, I have a specific question about China. Because, as you have mentioned, the global issues cannot be solved without the participation of developing countries. But as a Chinese, I have witnessed the country is also suffering some very serious issues. For example, our GDP growth rate is slowing down, and there are some unstable issues happening now, and probably more in the future. So, as the new generation of leadership will come out this year in China, I try to get some insight from you about what do you expect China will have in terms of its political development and transformation. Thank you.
Well, I'll give you some thoughts on the economic side. I'll have to rely on you on the politics. On the economic side, it's a very good question and an extremely timely one, and let me share with people why. One of the things that I actually think is very impressive about what's going on in China is that even though China has grown a little bit less than 10% a year for 30 years, which is pretty darn impressive, about a year and a half ago, some of the Chinese officials approached us and approached me personally and said, you know, we realize that the export and investment-led growth, our growth model, the structure of our growth, is not going to be able to be perpetuated for decades in the future. And just as a little reference point, we did some work that showed if you stayed basically on the same path by 2030, it'd be like adding 16 South Koreas to the international economy. So how would this work in absorptive capacity? So as you may know, in the 12 five-year plan, the next five-year plan, there's a focus on trying to rebalance, to move towards more domestic demand and consumption. But the challenge is, how do you do that? How do you adjust the structure of your economy? So over about the past year and a half, the bank has worked closely with Chinese authorities. They asked us to work with the DRC, the Development Research Council, major think tank under the State Council, as well as the Ministry of Finance, to look at a whole set of these issues. And the reason I said it's timely is that later this month, I'll be going to China and we'll be revealing this report. And you asked about the leadership change. It's been embraced by Li Keqiang, the executive vice premier, who some people think will be the next prime minister. It's been embraced by Xi Jinping. So it's got high-level engagement. And we're looking at all the questions, what you talked about, the social safety net system, the fiscal system. So, you know, many people read about the stories of people talk about land grabs in China, because many of the local governments fund themselves through the land sales because they don't have independent revenue sources. We're looking at sort of the open innovation system. We're looking at the role of the state-owned enterprises. We're looking at market pricing. We're looking at sort of environmental and green growth aspects because of the costs of the environmental aspect. Now, and the scope of this is quite staggering in terms of willingness to look at how one restructures the Chinese economy. Now, the devil will be in the details of implementation. It's just a report. But even here, we've worked to try to say, what would be some quick wins? And, you know, how do you engage the public on some of these issues to make them more sustainable? And when I asked, actually, Justin Lin, our chief economist, who's from China, I said, you know, this report exercise is interesting to me because, you know, China's got first-quality economic minds. Why were we kind of asked to do this? And his answer was very revealing. Part of it was, and for some from other developing countries, this is useful to know, China, the World Bank has a very good brand in China. The World Bank has been seen not only from the past financial side, but really from the analytical side of helping the report. So, you know, that was interesting as an example of a country that obviously had its own development model, but drew from the bank's experience. Secondly, he said, you know, in any government, you're going to have different factions and interests. And this report probably helps draw the issues together and helps catalyze them. So, again, on my optimistic side, I'm hoping this will help the next generation of leaders come in and have a bit of a template. Now, you know, will it get implemented? That I can't say. But as we step back and we look at the rest of the world, I think it's pretty darn impressive that a country that's grown 10% a year for 30 years has the presence to say, well, this just can't continue. How will we need to restructure our economy? Because I might ask, if I look at the US or Europe, maybe there's a little bit more evidence that people should be facing structural reform in those economies, and they're not exactly stepping as far forward. So I'm hopeful that this is another interesting example of the role the bank will play. We'll see over time what it develops. And if you want to get the details of it, by the end of February or early March, we'll have all the reports out there and other aspects so you can look at it yourself.
My name is Stephen Hurdle. I'm at the University of Pittsburgh, and actually was in Naperville at one point.
Yeah, your name sounds familiar.
Yeah. My question has to do with the role of information technology, since that's big at both Pitt and CMU, and if it's treated separately at the World Bank, and more importantly, do you see new initiatives coming along to increase the role of improving information technology in
it runs
your
across
activities?
everything. I'm sorry. Yeah. It runs across everything we do in that, let me start at the basic level. We're in 120 different countries, so part of it is I have to have offices that have the capacity and the capabilities, and I also have to deal with issues of cybersecurity. But I think the two most important areas I'd focus on is this open data initiative that I mentioned, which I think has a chance to really revolutionize how the bank works. And since this audience may have some economic professors and scholars, my personal example of this is kind of interesting. I used to go to fora that sometimes an economic professor would say, you've got some great data sets, but you still charge for them. Why do you charge for them? And I'd go back and I'd talk to my economic research team, and they'd say, well, we're adding value in here and there, and so on and so forth. And it took me about 3 rounds to go back and finally realize it was a slight offset of a few $1 million to the budget, right? Which everybody wants that. It's a good faculty lesson. And so eventually I said, no, look, we're just going to put this all out for free, okay? And we then also started to think about how we could ease the applicability of those sets. So we created an apps for development competition where we said to the whole world, look, just take our data sets, take the Millennium Development Goals, see what you come up with. And we had over 120 entries. You could see how it hit different software sites. There were groups in East Africa that picked up more than West Africa. And the things that we came up with, modeling, mapping, games, different insights, were things that, if I had people in a room for a year, they would have never come up with. So it's great for the institution. It's great for different applications. And once you start to think in this way, so we're now coming up with sort of integrity applications, so to make it easier for people to be able to report about, fraud or corruption issues. Some of you may have seen in the newspaper, we've come up with a new application dealing with some of the women and genders role. And so it opens the doors for the institution, but also connects to us a whole bunch of other people. We'll think, so in the answer to the question about Ghana, let's draw on the Ghanaians and the people in these communities or their researchers. So I think this is vitally important. Now, then there's also information technology as a tool of modern economy. So we were talking about this with some of the students. It's interesting, 10 years ago, I remember big discussions about digital divide and how the world would be left behind. And I pointed out that by working with countries in sub-Saharan Africa to change the telecommunications policy. So again, this is policy, not necessarily money change. You've gotten $70 billion of investment in mobile telephony in sub-Saharan Africa over the past 10 years. And you've gone from usage from about 10 or 20 to about 500 million sets. And of course, what then happens, as some people from that group knew in Kenya, is you've had some great innovation about using mobile telephones in banking systems. And what one starts to see, and this is, again, if you see development as a democratized form, you start to create the environment, and then people come up with the innovation to how you can use these mobile communications in a whole series of different devices. People know about how farmers now use this for commodity prices, and how you can, and as I said, what we're now trying to experiment more with, I was pointing over here with the question about the Arab world, is how we can connect this with people in social accountability so that when you do social welfare programs that with the government, that you can get people to be able to comment and engage more actively with the government. You not only get better programs, but also people don't feel divorced or separated from it. So I think the opportunities are enormous, and our door is open to other ideas.
Mr. Zoellick, thank you for coming. I'm Carl Henry Cesar, public policy student at Hines College. So development is important, but without the human beings feeling safe or having a quality education system, it's pointless. So my question for you is, when you go into the countries where there are severe human abuse rights, what is the decision that you and your core make to decide which is more important, knowing full well that with all the strategies and measures you come up with, it's very possible that when you leave, it will go back to the way it was or worse?
Let me just make sure, you mentioned education, but then and human abuse, was that? Okay.
And also specifically considering like mass epidemic in the DRC?
Yeah. Well, it all starts with the point that I made about we can have the best intentions, we can have the great ideas, we can have money, but if the local people don't do it, and this goes back to the governance of development, you're not going to get very far. So the reality is this actually gives us an entry point. Even though in this multilateral order I explained, and we have 187 shareholders, we're not supposed to be political, I've been trying to emphasize the importance of governance. So you've heard me talk about transparency. You've heard me talk about accountability. We've talked about how you can engage sort of social networks in terms of this. So that's partly the entryway that we try to use to try to say you need to do these things as part of good development policy as opposed to political policy. Now, I can't go so far as to say, you know, you need to have this form of government versus another form of government, but this is an entry point that we've been able to find common ground with across the full range of our membership. Now, you also asked about, particularly about sort of human abuse. Well, we can have some effect on this. I mean, obviously, you know, it covers different aspects. So in terms of good labor practices, IFC, our private sector arm, produced something called the Equator Principles, which are trying to encourage companies to upgrade their treatment of workers, their environmental sustainability, a whole series of issues. If you're dealing with a particular government, you know, we're not going to be involved in funding a program that deals with the abuse of people. The question is, and this is the honest to God hard question, so what do you do in a country such as Cambodia, which went through a genocide, and you've got some people in the government that basically lived through the genocide, and their view of life is pretty basic, which is when you're on top, you take yours. When you're on the bottom, someone can crush you. But you also have people in the government that are trying to modernize and reform. And the basic, you know, effort is, to the degree you can, you try to see if you can work with the reformers to try to support the modernization process. We also have a handle in that we don't want any of our money stolen, so we've got various fiduciary safeguards on the process. And we can try to share the lesson about supporting a more open system. Now, you know, and again, I'm sharing with people where the gray areas come in. You know, sometimes we work in situations where the overall political environment is frustrating, but then we have to decide if we can do a project that might deal with basic nutrition or human needs or HIV/AIDS, you talked about, or malaria, should we do it or not? You know, and those are the sort of issues that you have to try to work out with the international partners and others about whether you go forward with it. So DRC is a good example. So there are things that, you know, we won't provide basic support to the budget just without checks and balances, but we might do various types of investment projects on sort of education, or we might do various projects on malaria. We've been working a lot with some of the UN organizations, and we try to focus on particular countries. So that's the gray areas of development. You're working in difficult places. There was a book we talked about with some of the students called The Bottom Billion that was done by Paul Collier a year or two ago, which talked about post-conflict states or fragile states. There's actually about 1.5 billion people in those states. Those are very difficult environments. You know, Afghanistan, Haiti, Liberia. Now, Liberia is a country where you have a government and the leader trying to move in the right direction. But we have to then, in a sense, customize. And I guess the way I'd close it is, it goes back to my earlier point about how I see the challenge. It's not just a question of economic theory. It's a question of understanding the political economy and institutions in any country that you're working with. And you have to be practical and pragmatic about what works. And frankly, I'm not reluctant to say, if the money's likely to be stolen, or if this is a context where people are likely to get hurt in the process, we won't do it. And I guess one other last point is, it's an important part of this is that I've emphasized the openness and transparency, and I talked about open data. But just to give you another sense, one of the other things that we did in 2010 was we created a freedom of information system for the institution that is the first in the multilateral world. And it's done like the USF FOIA or the India FOIA. And so the difference is, as opposed to just releasing information, which is a positive list, we have a negative list. You ask for information, unless it falls in a specific exception, you get it. And the reason I mention this, because I talked about public institutions, and I'm partly explaining to you the role as an executive as much as an economist or a diplomat. Institutions like to hoard information. Information can be power. And when they release information, it's sometimes tough because people find things that go wrong, and it's embarrassing. Or to be fair, I've got a lot of very hardworking people that are very committed to projects, but they run the risk of what I've called the it should have worked, I wished it worked, I really wanted it to work, but you have to acknowledge it didn't work. And we have to learn from the mistakes as well as other things. So I try to encourage my staff to realize if poverty were so easy to overcome, somebody would have done it thousands of years ago. These are tough problems. But as an institution, I think we're stronger and better by being open, sharing the information. And as you've seen here, we reach with civil society groups, environmental groups, social groups, in other words. We may not always agree, and it's our right to argue back on something, but I think that makes a stronger public institution. This may seem obvious, but it's not so easy to do sometimes.
Hello, my name is Archana Menon, and I'm a student at the University of Pittsburgh studying international political economy. And my question has to do with the growing presence of multinational corporations in the developing world. And what do you think is the potential of corporate social responsibility to counter the phenomenon called the race to the bottom, where host countries agree to relax their environmental, social, and governance regulations in order to attract FDI? And what is the role of the bank in this debate?
Well, this may change a little bit with multinationals that come from different countries, and I don't mean to make this overgeneralization, but as a general matter, most of the multinationals that come from developed world are sensitive about reputation. They're sensitive to brand. And so I'm not saying they haven't made mistakes in the past, they won't make mistakes in the future, but we and others can work with them, and civil society can work with them to upgrade the quality. So, think of the probably things that happened on your campus and others about Nike or sports equipment preparers and sort of the working conditions. So we try to work with companies that want to upgrade standards, upgrade brands. Just one that out of the blue I'm involved with now is we were talking with some cocoa country producers because there's been reports about the labor conditions in cocoa plantations. It's not good for their brand. What can we do to sort of have a set of higher standards moving forward? This will be an issue with some of the multinationals coming out of some of the developing world. And again, one of the things that we can do as an institution is work with the governments and work with those companies and say, this is a short-term thinking. Eventually it'll hurt you. It'll hurt you in the country that you're operating. It'll hurt you for your brand. It may hurt you with your customers. And so to try to upgrade people's sense of standards. But the reality is where a lot of the most difficult working conditions take place are the informal economy. I mean, it's the sectors that, in part because the government may have regulatory requirements for wages, other conditions, that it forces people into an informal arrangement that no one really knows, or at least they're unaware of. So part of the challenge is also, this is one of the challenges in some developing countries. You have labor codes and rules that, they look nice on paper, and they may have come out of the 30s or something, but they don't bear a reality with the workforce. So part of the other lesson, too, is, how can you try to improve living conditions and working conditions for all your people? I guess the next step, I would say, is our next World Development Report is focusing on jobs. And it's interesting because this may reflect sort of my gaps in my education, but when I used to study labor economics, it tended to be kind of a discussion of sort of the structural rigidities in markets or the role of labor unions. But what it missed, what we're trying to look at, is how to see jobs as a sense of partly human development, social cohesion, different angles on jobs. And all of those relate to some of the things that I think you're talking about working conditions.
Hi, my name is Ernesto Alfonso. I just have two simple questions. One is, do you understand the concept of self-determination, that a sovereign nation has a right to determine for themselves the kind of economic policies and the political landscape that they decide? And the second is, since 1998, you've been a very strong advocate for the invasion of Iraq, the imperialist invasion of Iraq. So do you defend that today?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite. The first one was self-determination and countries' right to determine their own economic policies. Was that right?
Yes. Do you understand that concept? And the second is
the invasion of Iraq.
Yes. Do you defend that today?
Okay. On the first question, yes, the whole notion is sovereign states make their own decisions. And let's be very clear. I don't tell countries what to do. If they want to be able to draw from knowledge and experience or be able to have access to the money, that's their choice. Now, if you're saying, are we obligated to give money to people regardless of what they do with it, the answer to that is no, because at a minimum I have to make sure that it's not stolen. Or you've had some questions here about environmental sustainability or some of the aspects of human rights aspects. So yes, we have to try to work with countries so that they develop programs that use the money effectively, but ultimately it's their choice. So that goes to this point about clients. So I don't think, at least we have a difference on that one. On the question about Iraq, I was the U.S. trade representative at the time of the Iraq War. Frankly, I wasn't part of the key decision process. But my own sense is, if you go back and you look at some of the debates in the late 90s, you'll see resolutions from the U.S. Congress, you'll see bipartisan view about concern about the aspects that led to the cause of the war. I realize it's been hugely controversial, and I really think the question now will be what the people of Iraq do with their new country. And on that, I must say I'm a little worried, but I saw Prime Minister Maliki when he came here, and my own suspicion is that from the economic side, the Constitution allows varying degrees of autonomy, but if they, and I hope that they permit that autonomy as part of the development side, because if you look, for example, at the Kurdish region, you've seen some pretty good growth, and you've seen some pretty good opportunity, and I think, frankly, Iraq, sadly to say, is still struggling from its origins as a state that represents different communities that are having a hard time living together. But I see that as a tragedy.
Mr. Zoellick, thank you for sharing your views with us today. My name is Michael Furman. I'm a student here at Carnegie Mellon. I'd like to go back to the issue of climate change. My interest is, well, it seems like there's not a willingness to pay for carbon emissions at this point from both the U.S. Or there's not a capacity to reach agreement between the BRIC countries and the United States and other, individual states which have vested interest in this. In your purview, how can we prevent individuals from taking part in geoengineering projects which will inevitably create economic winners and losers? Specifically, like if there were blocks of nations like NATO or China on the other side of it, do you see a potential other than geoengineering as a fix for this?
Could you explain to me what you mean by geoengineering?
Well, it could be a number of things, particularly stratospheric aerosol geoengineering, the release of either sulfate oxides or aluminum oxides. This is, we're one of the leaders in discussing it here in our public policy department.
Okay. So just so I have it right, those would be sort of a macro step to try to deal with carbon or warming from an atmospheric, or like the ideas of putting various minerals in the oceans and things like that? Yeah, okay. Well, those are very serious steps, and I suppose, in a sense of scientific inquiry, it's probably good to research them and to learn more about them. I personally suspect it would be very hard for any one country to sort of intrude on the global commons with those in a very big way. Maybe, whether they could do so in their own sovereign space and others may be a different question. I guess, given the description that you gave of the lack of coming together at a global level among the major emitters, one I share, by the way, let me just explain what I think is the best thing that can be done, and it somewhat was reflected in the Cancun climate change meeting. I went to talk to President Calderon months in advance and said, look, I don't know the prospects of getting 195 countries to agree to this. But one opportunity is, can we work on some of the building blocks that will be good in and of themselves, and at some point will have to become the components if you are able to put something together at the global level. So energy efficiency, some of the technology centers that were created. We have a difference here, but I believe avoided forestation is part of this. Creating the possibilities for some of the soil carbon. Even working with key players. So, for example, we've helped sponsor something called the C40, which is the cities group. And you may very well know this, something I didn't know, but cities, the major cities, represent about 2/3 of the emission. And so there's a lot that can be done in individual cities with the construction and other aspects, and they're sort of coming together on their own to start to address these issues. Special problems, for example, the small island states, what one can do in alternative energy development, on and on and on. My point is, one of the challenges in the international legal system is that if I can get 150 countries to agree to something and they start to move it forward, should I wait because I don't have the last 45? Or should we start to move forward with those that you can? This is one of these sort of questions that gets debated in international councils. But my own view was, let's try to make progress where you can, in the sectors you can, get demonstration effects. In many of these cases, they have what used to be called the no regret strategy. You get multiple benefits from them anyway. Part of the lesson in life is if you have a model that everybody has to agree to everything all the time, you're going to be disappointed, and you're not going to make progress. So let's try to be pragmatic and build coalitions of support. And if you ever are going to bring everybody together in an arrangement, it's most likely going to be done through that building block approach. And just to connect it to the Rio Treaty, which I was a part of, is that the Rio Treaty, as you may recall, had that countries are supposed to develop national action plans and they were supposed to review. So what's to prevent countries from having combined national action plans? So you can have 150 doing a national action plan. So I've spoken a little bit more to one part of the climate change, but I just think it's important because what I'm really discussing here is in part an environmental, an economic, but also a financial issue. And if I could add one other component, we at the World Bank have a spring meeting and an annual meeting. Each one of these meetings, we've had what we call a Bali event, because it was first begun in Indonesia at the time of the Bali climate change meeting, which is to bring in the economic and finance ministers to talk about a climate change issue. Because the reality is, if you just leave it to the foreign and environmental ministers, you're not going to be dealing with the ministries that are going to be often making the important economic decisions. So part of the challenge in governments is to integrate this across their own ministries.
We have two final questions.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jacob Pruce. I'm a student in the Heinz College Public Policy Program. In recent years, secret trade agreement negotiations have been used to circumvent democratic processes to impose really bad intellectual property laws around the world. As citizens, for example, all of the censorship provisions in ACTA.
In what?
ACTA, the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, which was negotiated in secret over the last several years. And it was great effort by various parties to leak copies of the drafts so that civil society could begin to organize opposition against it.
Anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, when was that done? Because I was trade representative, I wasn't.
So that was in the last couple of years. My question is, as citizens, what are the most effective things we can do to stop the abuse and open these processes to the public? Thank you.
Well, I think I'd build on what I mentioned before, which is that when I was the trade representative, by law, we had a series, it was actually created in the 70s in the US, is that a series of requirements of open consultation, posting the information. There's a series of advisory groups that participate across the whole area. I actually created an assistant USDR for labor. I backed the one for the environment topic so we can increase the outreach for those communities. So I'm afraid I don't know the specifics. That was the one that you mentioned. So I don't know who negotiated it. I don't know which department. But in general, I think that whether for developed or developing countries, you want to try to have open consultations process. And look, that doesn't mean you're always going to agree. Your position may be different where somebody else comes from. But I do think you end up with better agreements. You tend to get better support. And again, at least in the U.S. context, but I realize you may be talking about different countries, you have something called the U.S. Congress. And the U.S. Congress certainly has a heavy-duty oversight over any executive branch agency in negotiation. And if the public disagrees, they petition Congress. That's what's in the Constitution. And then if they disagree with that, they vote the people out. So at least for the U.S., as a study of U.S. history, Americans love conspiracy theories. And I suppose if the Yankees won so many pennants, you would believe there's a conspiracy theory. But to be honest, it's often, I just tell you from being in government, there's less in the way of conspiracy than you might think. There's mistakes. There's oversights. There's people not working cooperatively together. There's stupidity. But this is a constant discussion that I have with my wife, who believes in conspiracy theories more than I do. But having been there, I will just tell you, a lot of things go wrong just for the reasons that things go wrong in life. So I believe in an openness and transparency system, but just, at least in the U.S., the conspiracy thing just doesn't sell to me.
I think we can take one more. We're running out of time, and you've been waiting. So let's, I think we have something of a hard stop that we have to live up to.
Mr. Zoellick, I wanted to applaud the World Bank for being open to different methods of providing aid. So as you mentioned,
could you speak up a bit, please?
Sure, rather than just relying on certain central bureaucrats dictating economic policy to people around the country, I think the World Bank has been open in the last 20 years to really different techniques. So I'm interested in your commenting on different types of microfinance, how the World Bank has been supporting microfinance. I'm curious what other things you've been, as you watch these little economic experiments going on in countries around the world, what other things you've learned in the last 3 to 5 years, things that you've learned from one country that can be applied in other countries or regions of the world, much as you gave the example of learning from Mexico and applying that in Brazil?
Well, since you had one before, I want to try to get one of these people. The basic point is there's a huge amount. In other words, what's really changed now is what we've tried to emphasize with South-South learning. And so whether it's education programs, health programs, the nature of experience about easing movement of things across border for trade, it's our existence, okay? Now, you mentioned microfinance. We are one of the biggest investors in microfinance, but I'll just add on this. I think one of the other lessons is there's no silver bullet. So some people thought microfinance was the silver bullet. You've seen discussions and debates about some of its weaknesses. I think in particular, one of the things that we're trying to do is how do you connect microfinance to small enterprises and small and medium-sized enterprises, which are also some of the growth aspects. So part of it, when you think of financial credit strategies or financial inclusion strategies, to think about it a little bit more holistically. So microfinance was credit to a particular small player. How do you think about not only credit, but saving systems? insurance systems. And I always remember a view that was expressed to me by a former president of Mexico, Zedillo. He said, for many poor communities, it's not that they have too many markets. They don't have enough markets. In other words, if they don't have credit access, then they're susceptible to loan sharks. But how can we use some of the technology and some of the ideas to now make this cost efficient at a much smaller level? So we had a question about agriculture. One of the things that I've had our people focus on for developing countries is what can we do in terms of crop insurance? Because I recall in visiting India once, one of the economists said to me, the Indian farmers that are committing suicide, this is a couple years ago, they're not the subsistence farmers. They're the people who have just started to move into the market economy, but they're such at the margin that if they pay for somebody to drill for water and they can't get the water, they feel hope is gone. So how can we take some of the efficiencies of information technology and lessons to build insurance? So I guess one other broader field, if I were going to suggest people to think about, risk mitigation or risk management, I think is going to be an important area. We do this now also with natural disasters. I mean, if with the Caribbean, we put together a special, in a sense, hurricane insurance. It's not done through pure insurance, but and we're learning an awful lot. About 90% of the natural disasters occur in the so-called Rim of Fire in East Asia, and we're learning a lot about preventive measures, sort of quick response measures, aspects that help sort of then insure some of these issues. So in a way, if you believe in markets and enterprise as I do, I think it's also important to recognize bad things happen. And how do you help people manage the risk process in an efficient way?
Okay. You want to take one more?
If my plane will let me, we'll trade this one.
Okay. Kanak Iyer from Kanak Financial. I'm a fledgling company. Just this morning I was, negotiating a business loan with my bank. And a wonderful lady, she said, can I get back to you in the afternoon? I said, you better hurry. I'm going to talk to the World Bank president, and I may not need you guys. So
did it work?
So you're a great tool in my negotiation skills.
But did it work?
Well, we'll see.
We'll see. Okay.
My draw today was Professor Skinner, who's a great scholar and a great role model for a lot of women. Now, you are going to China. China's, human rights violation against women is very well known. I mean, 400 million births, stopped in the last 30 years or so. Is the World Bank able to do anything to say that, we'll give you this money, but empower women? CNN running a program saying country full of men, I don't think is good for any of us. And the one more question is to do with sustainable technology. Carnegie Mellon is huge on sustainable technology development, renewable energy, both engineering-wise and public policy. Is the World Bank able to tell the developing countries, go in that direction? That makes more economic sense than following the path of the United States and becoming polluters in the bargain.
On your first question, our primary way of being able to help women in countries, whether China or others, is by showing that it's in the self-interest of the country. And so this point that I mentioned, and there's across a wide range of intervention, to show how it helps families earn more, how it helps countries become more productive, how it helps people draw on the human resources. And I think, that evidence has just started to develop, but I think it's going to be a big topic that's going to move. And for me as an executive in an institution, part of the challenge is how do we mainstream this in a way that isn't a check in the box? Yeah? And so, but it's interesting because as you start to think about projects, if you then start to think about sort of a gender dimension, it often gives you a different sort of angle. On the China point in particular, the main way that we may be able to have an influence is that this report that we highlighted also highlighted a fact that didn't get much attention, but it's basically that there's about, if I recall the numbers, about 4 million missing girls and women in the world. So that if you take a similar cohort in the developed world, and which is, it's about the size of a Yokohama or other similar sized cities, that's lost every year. And some of it is due to the birth policies or abortion policies. Some of it is due to the lack of nutrition at early parts. Some of it's due to maternal health and mortality. But it's to try to publicize what I think is a shocking fact about the loss every year of girls and women. So that's the prime way that we may be able to have an influence on it. Plus the ones that I mentioned about, in a sense, remember, we come from the economics profession, and self-interest is a motivating force. So then on your question about technology, yes, in a sense, from IFC, our private sector arm, one of our investment areas is actually trying to support some of the sustainability, the energy technology, energy efficiency technology. But, sometimes it's even more basic than that. For example, a very successful effort we made in China. This would surprise some people, but the banks were used to doing collateral-based lending. So we started a relationship with a bank on doing energy efficiency lending. And so what that meant was simply they didn't have the practice of, if you instituted a certain technology where you could change your cash flow because of energy efficiency, that you could lend against it. And then, given China, once you started to do this with a bank, then it started to spread throughout the whole country. So some of this, again, is simply sharing processes and procedures as countries start to expand the capacity of their financial and economic system. As I mentioned in the answer to the other question about the climate change, we've also tried with the UN and other partners to see how we can try to support some of the climate technology centers. And this is broader than climate. So, the World Bank actually was one of the founders of something in the agricultural area called the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. So we help coordinate, and we make a special contribution out of our income each year to these 15 centers around the world, about 14 of which are in the developing world, which do agriculture research. And this is one of the other aspects I should have mentioned. In the world of climate change, people know about the Green Revolution in India, but I think this is going to be another very critically important area to enhance seed varieties and knowledge about production. I mean, one other aspect we haven't touched on today, but it was in my mind because of Israel, was water. I grew up in the Midwest in the U.S., so I'm used to water availability. But when you go to many other countries, and I think this is going to be an ongoing pressure point for conflict and poverty and others, the lack of water availability. And there's some very interesting technologies being developed. So again, our role is partly to see how we can identify it, support it, and then help expand it with a network of other partners. And again, we're not monopolists. There's others in this field. How can we work in a networked fashion with them?
Yeah. Well, we've kept you over time. We thank you. I'd like to, before we say goodbye, I'd like to thank some others, the Global Studies major. I just remembered they were a sponsor of this event. The new CMU Navy Master's Program. We have a master's program in the broad area of cyber security and information dominance.
The grand strategy one sounded very interesting to me.
Yes, well, they're part of it, and some of the students are here, the master's students, and also the head of one of the most important charter schools in the country, Propel Schools. So I know that education is important to your mission. So we all thank you collectively for giving us so much of your time.